Thank you very much, Rosie and Kat, for the opportunity to talk to you today. Um, I am an environmental scientist based at Northumbria University, and I'm within the School of Geography and Natural Sciences. And my interest in textiles and fibres, so my research background is in soil ecology and soil science. And my interest in textiles originally came from understanding microplastics within the environment. And over the years, this has developed more specifically now to look at natural textiles and fibers and now looking at their biodegradation and their impacts on soils. So in this talk, I'm going to just briefly outline the soil context of the environment that we're considering in this talk. I'll give you a quick overview about microfiber research with a specific focus on fibers in soil research. And then I'm going to step a bit wider and consider textile in soils and their potential role in the circularity of textiles. So just to give you an introduction to why managing our soils and preventing pollution of our soils is important. That's because soils provide a wide range of different functions which we rely on as society for different ecosystem services. So these can range from our provision of food, fiber, and fuel, where we're relying on agricultural soils. We rely on soils for carbon sequestration, for water purification, for climate regulation, for nutrient cycling, which feeds into the provision of food, fiber, and fuel. Soils are also an important habitat for a wide range of soil organisms, and it's estimated that 25% of the biodiversity that we find on Earth actually live either fully or part of their life cycles happens within the soils. So soils are a very, very important habitat just in that consideration. Then there's other things that we rely on for soils. So if we think about cultural heritage and the preservation of artifacts, we rely on soils for construction and the provision of construction materials, and it also provides important foundations for human infrastructure. And a lot of the medicines as well that we rely on, some of those are derived from microorganisms living within the soil. And we are coming up to winter when we're expecting a lot more rainfall now, and the saturation levels of the soil are also important for monitoring and mitigating flood regulation as well. So this recognition that soils are important for ecosystem services is also underpinned in how we as society are going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's now a wide recognition that soils underpin many of the Sustainable Development Goals, and we need to manage and maintain soils and think about soil health more widely in order to try and meet the different goals that we have. So these range from obvious ones like climate regulation, flood regulation as well, but carbon sequestration and nutrient cycling, but all the way through to the other soil functions that I mentioned in the previous slide. So it's important that we think about pollution, that we think about managing soils, and that we try to find ways to mitigate and prevent future pollution. And again, the value of that soil biodiversity has been calculated or estimated. And in thinking about waste and textile waste, we rely on soils and the biodiversity. So that's a wide diversity of microbes, so fungi, bacteria, and archaea living within the soils for waste recycling. And that is a really key they are a really key community because any litter that enters the environment or the purposeful addition of different organic materials, we're relying on the decomposition activity by the soil biodiversity to provide us that waste recycling. And that waste recycling is a huge component of the soil biodiversity that we rely on for these ecosystem services, as well as the wide range of other ecosystem services that are shown on the left-hand side of that pie chart. That's very, very significant contribution if we're thinking about it in monetary terms. So it's estimated that soil biodiversity, as well as the production of fuel and fiber, accounts for $13 trillion, and this was in 2007. But the idea is that this is ecosystem services that we don't often see. We probably don't often think about it, but they are a crucial part. The soil environment is a crucial part of human society. So moving on to textiles and microfiber, microplastic research. In terms of sort of looking at where's the role of soils and the soil environment within the textile life cycle, we know that microplastics and the dominant form of microplastics tend to be microfibers that we find in the environment. A key route for their entry into the soil environment is via sewage sludge application, and this comes from the treatment of wastewater from washing machines. That's something that we do within our lives, and that effluent is treated. To some extent, sewage treatment plants are able to minimize the loss of microfibers into water effluent, but it means that those microfibers are trapped and become concentrated within the sewage sludge, which is then applied on land. And that is a key entry point for microfibers into the environment. But we also need to consider just wearing our clothes, drying our clothes releases microfibers into the air. And so we can also have aerial deposition of fibers onto the soil environment. We also have to consider that there will be dispersion of litter. So that could be textiles that are dumped on either landfills or just become part of roadside litter, for example, and those sort of mismanaged or unmanaged sources of textiles and fibers into soils. So we have a range of different entry points, so we need to consider what is the impact of these different textiles and fibers within different soil environments. So we know from other studies in freshwater and ocean, sort of aquatic studies, that microfibers tend to be the significant proportion of microplastics found worldwide. And similarly, we find that microfibers are the dominant microplastic particle found in soil environments. And usually this is due to exposure from application of sewage sludge and the use of composts in agricultural soils. And it's interesting just looking back to the research, the early research. So these studies by Habib et al. And Zubris and Richards, they weren't specifically looking for microplastics. They were interested to see if they could use, if they could find markers of sewage sludge application in fields where there was a history of sewage sludge application. So they were looking for markers to see could they look for potentially plastic particles or fibers to indicate that sewage sludge had been applied on land previously. And they were able to find that microfibers, and here they were looking at just plastic microfibers, they could detect these even after 15 years of sewage sludge application. And this was one of the first studies that sort of highlighted that and the data, the prevalence was 1.2 synthetic fibers per gram of soil. And this research has sort of expanded over the years to try and understand what is the prevalence of microfibers within agricultural systems, and thinking about that direct link with the application of sewage sludge. So this is an example of a study by Corradini in 2019, where they focused on sewage sludge applications over a different temporal scales. And they were able to find that and here they're just looking at microplastics, which included microfibers, where they were detecting microplastics in fields where there'd been no history of sewage sludge application. And then they're able to relate the microplastic abundance to the different amounts of sludge application. And then they were finding the highest sludge microfiber count or microplastic count just in the sludge itself. So this was, again, so further evidence of that direct link with washing our clothes and the fibres entering the environment. So from a soil perspective, soil scientists have been considering, well, what are the potential impacts of microfibers as a form of microplastic pollution in the soil environment? And it is hypothesized that depending on the shape or the form of the microplastic, the type of soil, it is likely to accumulate in soil profiles and potentially impact soil physical properties like soil structure and bulk density, potentially interact with microbes and with plants as well, and influence process rates of nutrient cycling and water flow potentially. There's also hypotheses that microplastics will continue to decompose within the soil and microfibers as well. Potentially, we need to consider leaching and the production of other secondary chemicals potentially, and that within that soil environment, these microplastic and microfiber particles are going to continue disintegrating to form even smaller particles known as nanoplastics. There's also the potential for these particles within the soil environment to be taken up by plants, and they could then start accumulating in plant biomass and affecting potentially crop production or animal and human health eventually. We don't really know what is the influence of the microplastics yet on the production of greenhouse gases and how that affects sort of nitrous oxide, methane, and carbon dioxide fluxes. So it's still very much ongoing work in considering what are the impacts of microplastics and microfibers in soil environments. So I've just put together some indication of the different research that's been happening over the years, and these are studies that are specifically focused on microfibers in soil environments. So, for example, I was involved in a project where, so ingestion by soil organisms, these studies have tested whether earthworm or the soil organisms are able to ingest fibers and whether they are then detected in the digestive tract of these different organisms. So we are able to show that soil organisms, just like any other organism in environments that have been studied, so in aquatic environments, they're not able to discern between different particles. And because especially earthworms are ingesting soil as part of their burrowing or feeding processes, that any microplastic or microfiber particle is likely to be ingested. There's potential for those fibers or plastic particles to be retained within their gut system and potentially change their behavior and their fecundity. Other studies have gone out in terrestrial environments and collected different mammal feces. So example, I was involved in a study here by Weber et al., where we sampled hedgehog, rabbit, and sheep feces that were sort of collected from the environment, and we were able to account for the prevalence of microfibers as well as other microplastics within animal feces. So that, again, the two routes for that are potentially ingestion. For example, of hedgehogs, they feed on earthworms. So are they ingesting earthworms that have fibers within them? Or are we looking at a sort of aerial deposition as well, where the feces are left on the soil surface and they are just depositing on the surface of different fecal samples. Studies have looked at how microfibers are affecting bacteria in terms of their community composition, starting to understand what's happening with plant growth. Is there impacts on how well plants are growing and how they are able to take up nutrients? And also a growing area of research is understanding what is happening to soil properties. So that can be changes to soil density or compaction, as well as understanding changes to nutrient cycling. So it's quite lots of ongoing research focusing on fibers and soils. So what about natural textiles, because we know that microfibers are not only synthetic in origin, but that we, especially in aquatic studies, there's a prevalence of cotton and wool microfibers as well. So it's been interesting, actually, when thinking about this, and that soil science has been using cotton strips as a method to test for soil health. And this method is simply to use untreated cotton fabric. So the sort of favored type of cotton textile was a painter's canvas, and they would just cut that up into strips and bury that in different soil environments and monitor the level of cotton degradation, which was an indication of the activity and the diversity of the microbial community within different habitats. So that was in the 1980s when that method was started up. But it has also now continued into citizen science. So this is an example of a study led by Oliver Knox in Australia with the very catchy title of Soil Your Undies. And here farmers were encouraged, across Australia, were encouraged to bury cotton underwear in their fields, and these were monitored over time. And then the rate of degradation was an indication of soil health. So the faster that the underwear degraded, the better was the better soil health, or the better was that microbial community within that particular field. And it was a really good way for engaging farmers in thinking about soil health and soil management and how that impact the soil microbial community, which is responsible for the degradation of natural fibers. So that's one way that so textiles have been used by soil science in the past. But now when we're thinking about natural textiles and what to do with textile circularity and waste management, there's a growing realization that natural textiles are not a direct comparison to the plant fibers that they were originated from. And that's because textile fibers are now created with a wide range of dyes and different finishes and different chemical finishes, which are added to add water repellency or antimicrobial agents, flame retardants, etc. And that also that the weaving and fiber technology has advanced so much that the way that fabric is now produced is towards durability, and that would affect how accessible it is for soil microbes to decompose and degrade in the environment. So with that in mind, here at Northumbria, with colleagues who are now in the Impact Plus team, we set up a short-term biodegradation experiment where we were looking at the degradation of cotton and then cotton and polyester blends. And we've got our original textiles are here on the top panel. So this is 100% undyed, unfinished cotton. We dyed the cotton samples yellow as well. And then we were able to source other cotton polyester blends, also in the yellow color, ranging from 48% cotton all the way and 52% polyester, all the way to 100% polyester. And we buried these in a natural soil, for 8 weeks. And over that time period, we extracted the textiles and had a look to see what was happening to that degradation. So as expected, this is our control, 100% cotton, that over 8 weeks, we were starting just to get tiny fragments left of that cotton. But what was interesting was that if we dyed that cotton just with a commercially available home dye testing kit, but the presence of that dye slowed the decomposition and the degradation of our 100% cotton. And then when we're looking along our cotton polyester gradient, and we could see, so and the weight loss data shows that we've had greater weight loss at the with the fabric samples with a higher amount of cotton and a low polyester content compared to 100% polyester content that just sort of started fraying around the edges, but otherwise remained more or less intact. So this has really got us thinking about what are the implications on soil health and the soil environment if textiles enter the soil environment. So we're not just thinking about the fibres themselves, but larger pieces of textile waste. So similar studies have been done looking at the impact of different finishes on textiles. So this is a study from Milosevic back in 2016, where again they had 100% cotton and cotton polyester blends, but here they were focusing on silver titanium oxide nanoparticles to see what was the impact of different finishes on cotton and cotton polyester degradation. And so similarly, their experiment was over 46 days. They're showing that they found virtually no cotton in their control, so just natural cotton on its 100% cotton on its own. But once you add these finishes or the cotton is blended with polyester, then that slows down the rate of textile degradation. But thinking about so there's there's a couple of studies like that, but thinking about them from a soil ecology or soil science experiment perspective, a lot of the studies sort of report in their methods and materials that they have used a soil, but often when you read into the detail, it's a commercially available compost that they have used. Sometimes they've used a compost mix in with some soil. And there's also a lack of studies that have compared different soil types. And we know from soil science that the soil type, the organic matter content, the clay content, the microbial community that's inherent within that soil is going to impact the rate of degradation. So we need more studies that are considering an actual soil rather than a proxy for soil. Often these are incubation experiments, and there's a lot of reasons why incubation studies are done, because they are easier to manage and you can control the conditions. But it means that often the experimental conditions are done under maybe a high temperature, so 25 degrees Celsius, for example, under constant moisture. And these don't really replicate natural conditions which textile waste would face in the soil environment. And then there's also very little consideration of, well, what happens to soil properties and soil health as those textiles are degrading. So yes, we can show that textiles either degrade or they don't at different rates within the environment, but how does that degradation impact soil health isn't really a focus. And that's because these studies are like the Milosevic example that I mentioned, are coming from a very textile perspective and not from considering the terrestrial environmental impact. And so why should we consider the environmental impact on soils? And that's because I think there's a link between improving textile circularity and maintaining and managing soil health. So we know that a lot of textile waste, so 92 million tons is produced annually, but only 1% of these textiles are recycled. We know that we are in different environments able to identify synthetic as well as natural fibres in environmental samples. And we also know that the fashion and textile industry are facing a challenge of reducing their environmental impact and trying to move towards more circular garment life cycles and moving away from situations like shown in this photo, where textiles are dumped, and more often than not, this is textile waste that is dumped in the environment in the global south. So I guess the challenge is, can we find a way to manage textiles that also can promote soil health? So this is something that within the Impact Plus project, we've been looking at in more detail. So I'm just going to touch on a study that I've been involved with looking at the biodegradation of wool and soil. And this was a collaborative project funded through Impact Plus, working with Nikki James and Veronica Capsali at the University of the Arts London. And Nikki and Veronica are interested in wool properties and wool textiles and the range of different wools that are produced here in the UK from native sheep breeds. So they provided us with a range of different wool samples, and myself and Phil then set up a degradation experiment to see how these different wool samples behave in the environment. And because we were aware that the soil testing that has happened previously has focused on incubation conditions, in this case, we buried our fabric samples in a natural soil under real-world environmental conditions. So this experiment ran from April to July. So we had just funding for a 3-month burial study. But we monitored the environmental conditions, so the soil temperature and soil moisture conditions over the 3-month period. And at the end of the 3 months, we extracted the wool and cotton swatches that we had. And so I'll just give you a short insight into what we were finding. So in terms of visual observation, so these are soils that have been buried in an environment that is a living soil, an actual soil. So what was really interesting was these are different wool types. Some of them have been dyed, some of them are a natural dark or black color. But this example here, T8, we were able to observe active root ingress into our wool swatches. And as we were extracting those samples, we were also observing different soil fauna interacting with within the fibres of our different textile samples. What was also very clear was the variation in the microbial colonization along our wool samples. So this is, and also the attachment of soil as well onto the surface of the textile swatches. We also had cotton samples as a comparison to the wool. And again, we were able to see sort of contrasting microbial growth. This is a wool sample, this is a cotton, where the microbial community tended to form a sort of dry, thin, black, crusty microbial layer, whereas on the wool samples, the microbial growth tended to be sort of yellow, cream, orange color, and just visually very, very different to what we were seeing on the cotton samples. We were also, when the swatches were being cleaned, and we were also very aware that there was an increase for some of these swatches, an increase in the fibres that were being shed during cleaning, which also impacted how we calculated the weight loss of our samples. And as we would expect, our acrylic, our synthetic wool was the easiest to clean, and you pulled it out of the ground and it looked like it was just the same as when it had been buried 3 months earlier. So we're able to calculate a mass change. So this is based on a comparison of before and after burial weight loss of our wool samples and our cotton samples. So just to orientate you along the graph, on the y-axis, we have our percent mass change. So if you multiply this by 100, this would be 50%, and this is no change at the top. And then along the bottom are the codes for our different fabric swatches. At the top here, indicating very little change in very little weight loss, is our synthetic 100% acrylic wool. And the purple box here is the degradation of our cotton samples. So at the higher end of, so showing less weight loss. And then the different colors represent the different ranges of different UK native sheep breeds that were representing our different wool samples. And on average, our wool samples lost about 47% mass loss. And we've got within these different wool samples our combination of whether they've been dyed, finished in some way. They've all been knitted to the same tension and size. but there were differences in the fineness of the wool and other wool characteristics, which we are investigating further to see how that impacts the biodegradation. But just to note, when you are doing studies like this, there are huge challenges in protocols, and it's worth mentioning that the intensity of cleaning, we have to remove as much soil as possible in order to try to get a weight measurement of the remaining textile. And this has to be done very carefully, so full commendation to Phil, who was a research assistant, and the care and dedication that he showed, that he used in sort of ensuring a consistent approach across all of these different samples, which does mean that there is high variability in the data, but we can sort of identify some trends. And so although the, sorry, we got this one. So the data, because we also wanted to focus on, well, what is happening to soils as the textiles are degrading. So I'm just going to focus on some soil measurements that we took. So this is measurements for pH, and pH is an important indicator of how alkaline or acidic the soil environment is, and changes in pH are strongly associated with changes in the soil microbial community activity and composition. So again, along the y-axis is our pH scale. Along the x-axis are the different fabric swatches. We have our control. So this is a background soil. This is just a soil on its own. And we sampled specifically for our soil measurements the soil that was 5 centimeters and immediately below our fabric swatches when we removed them from the ground. So this is the pH in our cotton controls. So slightly lower than our natural soil. And then we've got all of our other wool samples where we can see different, mostly lower than the background soil pH, but there are differences depending on the characteristics of that wool type. So we can see that that short-term 3-month degradation of wool is affecting soil pH in some way. And then looking at nutrient availability. So here on the y-axis, we've got ammonium, a concentration of ammonium measured. Again, these were samples taken directly below the textile. And on the left-hand side, number 20 is our soil only, so just our background soil conditions after 3 months. 22 and 21 are our cotton samples, and 10 is the synthetic acrylic wool. And then the rest of these in the blue, orange, and green colors are our different wool samples. And wool contains a lot of protein, so it's very high in nitrogen. And we can see that as the protein within the nitrogen content is potentially the microbial community are responding to that nitrogen availability within the wool itself and degrading the wool as a source of nitrogen. Potentially that wool, as it degrades, is releasing more available forms of nitrogen. Another idea to test is that the changes in that microbial community, because they are decomposing the wool fibers, are subsequently also interacting with nitrogen cycling. And again, we can see that with the different wool types that were measured, we are seeing a range of different effects, and we're looking at this more closely, so relating the wool properties with increasing either high or low amounts of ammonium. Similarly, when we measured nitrate, which is another important form of nitrogen within the soil environment, again, just to orientate you, we have number 10 is our acrylic wool, 100% synthetic. 20 and 21 are our 2 cotton samples. No, sorry, I got that wrong. Right. 20 is our background soil. 21 and 22 are the cotton samples, and then 15 and the rest of the greeny, bluey, orange ones are our wool samples. And again, it's an indication that nitrogen cycling with the nitrogen function of the soil microbial community is being impacted in some way, either directly or indirectly, as those microbes are decomposing the different materials. And it's also clear that the acrylic is having no impact because nothing is changing in that environment. And the cotton samples, which are mainly cellulose and have a very low nitrogen content, are not impacting the nitrogen cycling in the same way as the wool samples. So because our samples have different dyes, they're different dyes, some of them are synthetic dyes, some of them had natural plant dyes, some had mordant present, some had no mordant present. And although we don't have full replication across all of the different wool types, the results are not statistically significant, but we can see that there is some sort of impact. There's likely to be an impact that needs to be explored further in whether synthetic dyes are used, so commercial dye, whether what's termed a natural dye is used, and the associated chemicals that go along with dyeing wool textiles, for example. So just as we saw in the cotton study that I showed earlier, the presence of these chemicals are likely to be impacting biodegradation and the microbial community. So how does this then link to textile circularity and soil health? So there is interest in what are called soil-to-soil textiles. So this is an example from an organization called Fibres, where they are interested in and sort of scoping the potential for natural textiles. So example from sheep or cotton that rely on land for their production. Those textiles are made into garments. At the end of that life, is there potential for these to be composted and those natural fibres to then be reapplied to pasture land or farmland to support the production of these fibres again. So it links to those soil functions that we rely on soil function for the production of fibres. And is there a route for thinking of textile circularity and soil health? But from a soil science perspective, there's very little consideration as to what are the impacts on soil or what is the impact of direct burial, for example, rather than going through a composting step. And I think this is, it's a very interesting perspective and potentially an interesting route for textile waste, and particularly natural textiles. And is this an alternative to recycling? So in conclusion, for the soil-to-soil textile concept to work, we need more understanding of how natural textiles are degrading in the environment. And especially we need to consider the finishes that are applied to natural textiles, whether these are labeled as natural dyes. These natural dyes also have other associated chemicals to aid the dyeing process or other finishes. And we need to be more aware of the chemicals that are applied to these natural textiles and whether all of them are suitable for application to land. And we also need to consider the impact to soil health and soil ecosystem functions, and that it's not enough to say that our natural textile has disappeared after X amount of time and everything is all right, because we don't want to be in a situation where we are inadvertently creating a new pollution, a new form of pollution further down the line. And that is where as a research within Impact Plus is looking to understand and to improve the evidence base for these concepts of thinking about textile circularity. So I will end there, and I'm very grateful to research assistants, especially Phil and Abby, and members of the Impact Plus team. Thank you to Veronica and Nikki for allowing the collaboration with the Unusual Project, and to Impact Plus for funding. I've got my email address there if you want to contact me with any further questions, and I'm happy to answer further questions now. So thank you very much.